London, 1815. The city shimmered beneath 1,000 gaslights, its wealth and gossip glittering like the jewels draped upon the ladies who filled Grosvenor House that evening. The orchestra swelled with triumphant strings, and laughter rippled across the ballroom as if the air itself conspired to forget that the world beyond those gilded walls had ever known sorrow or war. Yet among the swirling gowns and murmured flattery stood a woman who refused to forget. Lady Evelyn Ashbourne. Once adored, now quietly pitied, she lingered near the marble pillars as though they alone could shield her from the glances that pricked sharper than pins. Her gown, pale silver trimmed with pearls, caught the candlelight like moonlit armor, but her eyes, calm, watchful, unyielding, betrayed the exhaustion of a heart long at war with society's judgment. She had come because her aunt insisted that a lady could not hide forever. London's season, they said, was merciful to the resilient. But mercy was a currency the ton rarely spent, especially on widows with opinions. Conversations broke around her like fragile glass. She caught the fragments, her husband's debts, her temper, her solitude, each whispered with a feigned sigh of concern. Evelyn's hand tightened around her fan, her smile faint and perfectly practiced. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. The orchestra began a waltz and couples glided to the center, their movements elegant, rehearsed, shallow. The scent of roses and candle wax hung heavy, and she thought briefly of her late husband's study, stale with tobacco and unspoken cruelty. A shiver passed through her. She despised herself for remembering. A man's voice, sharp with arrogance, cut through the music. "Lady Ashbourne, is it true you've sworn never to marry again? A tragedy indeed, for so fine a fortune to go unclaimed." The laughter that followed was soft but poisonous. Evelyn turned, her composure unbroken. "Some fortunes," she said coolly, "are better left unclaimed." A few nearby ladies hid their smiles behind gloved hands. The man, a viscount's son with more pride than wit, flushed scarlet, and used to being dismissed so cleanly. His embarrassment curdled into spite. "Ah, but perhaps it isn't independence you cherish, my lady? Perhaps it's simply that no man has yet been fool enough to try twice." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Before she could answer, another voice intervened, low, steady, and edged with quiet command. "That will do." The murmurs stilled. The newcomer's presence was like a shadow cast across the hall, imposing yet controlled. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, had returned to London scarcely a fortnight past. Rumor named him many things: hero, recluse, widower, rake reformed by duty. Yet at that moment he was only a man standing between cruelty and its target. His dark coat caught the light as he regarded the offender with calm disapproval. "If a gentleman cannot manage his words," he said, "he should not wield them in company." The Viscount's son muttered an apology and vanished into the crowd, leaving behind a trail of awkward silence. Evelyn's pulse thundered. She had not expected rescue, least of all from him. The Duke inclined his head slightly, a gesture that suggested both courtesy and challenge. "Forgive my intrusion," he said. It seemed the evening had grown rather less civil than advertised. His voice carried the faint rasp of a soldier long accustomed to command. She met his gaze, measuring, unwilling to show gratitude she did not feel. "You mistake me, your grace," she replied evenly. "I require no defender. London merely grows bored and I provide the evening's sport." A flicker of something unreadable passed over his expression, admiration, perhaps, or curiosity. "Then I shall take it as an honor to have interrupted their entertainment." He extended his hand. "A dance, Lady Ashbourne, lest they think us both humorless." Around them the orchestra's melody softened, expectant. Evelyn hesitated. To accept would feed the gossip she loathed, to refuse would make her appear wounded. "Your Grace," she said at last, "if I wished to be a spectacle, I might have fainted earlier." The Duke's lips curved, half amusement, half respect. "As you wish," he murmured, bowing. "Though I dare say London has not yet seen a lady who declines a duke so elegantly." As he withdrew, she exhaled, her hands trembling slightly against her skirts. The room had begun to breathe again, the murmurs shifting, reforming. Yet she felt the weight of his gaze linger, steady, observant, impossible to ignore. She turned toward the terrace to escape the heat, the night air cool against her flushed cheeks. Beyond the glass doors, London's lights blurred through a misting rain. The city hummed below, indifferent and eternal. She leaned against the balustrade, her reflection faint in the window. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the ache beneath her composure, the loneliness that no amount of pride could banish. Behind her, the door opened. Footsteps, measured and certain. "Do you always flee after battle?" the Duke asked quietly. She did not turn. "Only when victory feels like defeat." A pause, then the rustle of his coat as he joined her at the railing, leaving a deliberate space between them. "You carry yourself like a general," he said. "Every glance, every word, precise, defensive." She let out a brittle laugh. "A woman must if she wishes to survive London's kindness." His gaze softened. "You speak as though I am part of that cruelty." "Are you not?" she countered. "You stand among them. You dine with them. You smile when they wound." He regarded her for a long moment, rain tapping lightly against the windows. "I smile," he said, "because not smiling gives them victory." For the first time she looked at him fully. There was something in his eyes, tiredness perhaps, or the hollow ache of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. The rumors had not captured that. "Then you are wiser than most," she said softly. "Or simply lonelier." The words slipped out before she could recall them. He inclined his head. "Both, I fear." The orchestra swelled again inside, a waltz rising like a memory. For a fleeting second, the world beyond the terrace vanished. The gossip, the debts, the weight of expectation. Only the quiet rhythm of rain and heartbeats remained. She straightened, composure restored. "I should return before someone imagines a scene." He stepped back, granting her passage. "Let them imagine," he murmured. "They will anyway." Their eyes met once more, and in that look hung something fragile, respect tinged with curiosity, a promise neither dared acknowledge. Evelyn passed him without another word, her perfume trailing like a question he could not answer. Inside, the music carried on, oblivious. The Duke remained by the terrace, his gloved hand resting on the cold stone, his jaw tight with thought. The woman who had refused his hand had managed, without effort, to seize his attention more completely than any beauty in London. He watched her vanish into the crowd, silver gown gliding like mist. For the first time in years, Alexander Hawthorne felt the faint, disquieting pull of wonder, an emotion he thought war had long since taken from him. Somewhere across the ballroom, a whisper began anew. "The widow and the Duke." The words spread like smoke, curling through candlelight, finding every eager ear. Yet neither noticed. Evelyn, proud and silent, walked on with her head high. The Duke turned once more toward the rain-streaked glass, a faint smile touching his lips. In a city that worshipped appearance, one woman had dared defiance. And in that defiance he found the first stirring of desire and danger he had known in years. The night was far from over. The morning light over Ravenshire estate fell through tall windows, glancing off the polished mahogany desk where Alexander Hawthorne sat reading the solicitor's letter for the third time. The ink was crisp, the language merciless. "By right of debt and inheritance, the late Lord Ashbourne's estate shall fall under the temporary guardianship of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire, until the widow's financial affairs are resolved." He exhaled, closing his eyes. Of all the estates in England, it had to be hers. He had no wish to intrude upon Lady Evelyn Ashbourne's solitude, yet duty, that old tyrant, demanded his involvement. He set the letter aside, staring out into the rain-laden fields beyond the glass. "So," he murmured half to himself, "fate insists we meet again." When Evelyn received the same letter, her first instinct was disbelief, followed swiftly by outrage. That the man who had witnessed her humiliation at Grosvenor House, who had stood between her and scandal, should now preside over her home, her livelihood, her dignity, was an irony almost cruel in its precision. She tore open the seal again as though repetition might change the words. The ink did not yield. She was to meet the Duke within the week to review the accounts, debts and sale of properties. Her hand trembled only once before she steadied it against the writing desk. She would face him with composure. No man, not even a duke, would see her weakened by circumstance. Their meeting took place in the grand study of Ashbourne Manor, a room lined with books that had belonged to her late husband, their spines untouched by dust or affection. The fire burned low, the scent of old paper mingling with rain drifting through an open window. Evelyn entered first, her posture regal though her gown was simple. The Duke rose from his chair. "Lady Ashbourne," he greeted. His tone was polite, formal, but his eyes revealed the briefest flicker of warmth. She inclined her head. "Your Grace, I trust London's weather has not dampened your sense of duty." "It never does," he replied. "Though it seems fate has an unkind humor, assigning me stewardship of what should be yours." She crossed to the hearth, refusing to sit. "It was mine until debt made it otherwise. I assure you, Your Grace, I have no intention of keeping you in this role longer than necessary." He regarded her silently for a moment. Then we are of one mind. My wish is only to see your affairs settled honorably. There was sincerity in his tone, too much, perhaps. She met his gaze, cool but curious. Honor is a luxury, your grace. Widows learn to trade in necessity. He smiled faintly, almost ruefully. Then perhaps it is time necessity met its match. Days passed, and with them came endless papers, ledgers, and signatures. Yet what should have been a matter of numbers became something more intricate, a slow, wary dance of pride and empathy. Evelyn worked beside him each morning, her intelligence sharp, her wit sharper still. She challenged his decisions, questioned his motives, and refused to defer to his rank. He found it maddening and magnetic in equal measure. When she laughed, rarely but freely, it startled him. It was a sound unspoiled by performance, soft and honest. For her part, she began to notice the gentleness beneath his restraint, the way he listened without interruption, how he never spoke her name as gossip did, with pity. One afternoon, as rain drummed softly against the windows, a servant delivered a parcel addressed to her. She unfolded the wrapping to find a single white rose pressed between parchment. No note accompanied it. Her heart stilled. Only one man in London could have sent such a token, the Duke of Ravenshire, who was known to cultivate roses imported from Spain, the same he had once gifted to a fallen comrade's widow. She stared at it for a long moment, torn between gratitude and fear of implication. Then, with deliberate calm, she placed it back in its wrapping and set it aside. She would not be anyone's charity nor anyone's rumor. By evening, the Tun had found its story. At a dinner hosted by the Countess of Wexford, murmurs flitted through the hall like restless moths. The Duke sends flowers to the Ashbourne widow, one lady whispered. How romantic. Another smirked. How predictable. Evelyn felt the words long before she heard them, the glances prickling her skin as she entered the room. Across the table sat the Duke, expression unreadable. When the Countess raised a teasing brow and said, Your Grace, we hear your roses travel faster than your carriages, he did not flinch. Instead, he turned his gaze to Evelyn and replied evenly, Then may they travel with more honor than the tongues that carry them. A hush fell. The Countess flushed, muttering an apology masked as laughter. After dinner, when the crowd dispersed into the music room, Evelyn found him standing near the window, the city lights glimmering behind him. You should not have done that, she said softly. London thrives on spectacle. You've only fed it. He turned toward her, his expression quiet but resolute. Let them speak. They will find something else tomorrow. I could not sit silent while they tore your name apart. She shook her head. You think me fragile, but I have endured worse than whispers. I do not think you fragile, he said. I think you deserve peace. His words were simple, yet they reached a place she had long kept guarded. For a moment neither spoke. The rain outside deepened, tapping against the glass like restless fingers. You should not care, she whispered, her voice trembling. We barely know each other. That is precisely why I care, he answered. I know enough to see what others refuse to. She looked up then, truly looked, at the steadiness of his gaze, the faint scar near his temple, the quiet weariness of a man who had buried too many dreams on battlefields. The silence between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. Then, before she could retreat, a footman entered with a letter, bowing low. For Lady Ashbourne, he announced. The seal bore the crest of her late husband's creditors. She accepted it with a nod, the brief spell shattered. He inclined his head slightly. If that letter brings trouble, I expect you will face it as you do everything else, alone. Her lips curved, though her eyes were sad. Alone is safer, your grace. It carries fewer debts. He wanted to protest, to tell her that solitude was its own kind of ruin, but the words stayed trapped behind discipline. She stepped back, the letter clutched to her chest. Good evening, she said, her tone once more composed, distant. He bowed. Good evening, my lady. As she left the room, her footsteps fading down the corridor, the Duke stood motionless, his reflection caught in the rain-streaked window. The city beyond seemed vast and uncaring, yet for the first time since returning from war, he felt the ache of something perilously close to longing. Evelyn, in her pride and sorrow, had become more than a duty. She was a riddle he could not set aside. The rose she had returned lay upon his desk upstairs, still white, still perfect. He imagined her hands placing it down, steady despite the tremor in her heart. Outside, the rain eased into mist. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, a carriage rattled over cobblestones, carrying letters, rumors, and the slow, uncertain pulse of something that might yet become love. The Duke turned from the window, his expression unreadable but his eyes alight with determination. London would not have the last word. Not this time. The storm had begun its relentless march by mid-afternoon, turning the sky above Ravenshire estate into a bruised canvas of slate and ash. Rain pelted the roof in sharp, insistent rhythms, and the wind rattled the tall windows with a persistence that made the house itself seem alive with unrest. Lady Evelyn Ashbourne lingered in the drawing-room, her fingers lightly grazing the ivory keys of the pianoforte, though the music faltered in her hands. She had played this piece countless times, yet today it felt unfamiliar, as though the melody carried the weight of every whisper, every expectation she had sought to evade. Outside, the storm raged, but within these walls, a different tempest waited, one that no thunder could drown. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, entered quietly, his coat still damp from the sudden downpour that had forced him to gallop through the estate grounds. He paused, taking in the room, the amber glow of the fire, the lingering scent of lavender, the way the piano's notes hung trembling in the air. He did not speak at once, allowing her to continue, letting the music fill the silence between them. Evelyn did not turn, she played on, aware of his presence, conscious of the subtle authority in the room. It was not his rank that commanded the space, but his quiet patience, the kind that had haunted her conscience ever since their first encounter at Grosvenor House. At last, she lifted her hands from the keys and exhaled, turning toward him with a measured expression. "You have watched long enough," she said, a trace of reproach in her voice. "Surely a duke has more pressing matters than listening to a widow's idle tinkering." His lips curved faintly, not with amusement, but with a softness that unsettled her. "I find that what we consider idle often reveals more than we admit," he replied. "Your music, your hands, your quiet defiance, they speak louder than any announcement the tongue could muster." She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of incredulity crossing her features. "Do you flatter all women in your care, your grace, or only those whose estates compel your attention?" "Only those whose souls refuse to bow," he said simply, stepping closer, the firelight glinting off the steel clasp of his coat. "You, Lady Ashbourne, speak truths that others conceal behind manners, and I cannot turn away." The confession, though tempered, landed with the force of artillery, startling her as much as the storm outside. She shook her head, retreating a step. "You speak as though we are equals. We are not. I am a widow. You are a duke. To indulge in such words is reckless, if not foolish." His gaze softened, steady and unyielding. "And yet, the heart is rarely persuaded by reason, my lady. It insists on its own terms, regardless of rank or propriety." Evelyn's breath caught. She had prepared herself for civility, for duty, for measured conversations regarding ledgers and property. She had not prepared for him to speak as if he had read the chambers of her soul. "You overestimate your insight," she murmured, though her voice betrayed a tremor she refused to acknowledge. "And underestimate the perils of your boldness. Society has already judged us, your grace, and whispers are sharper than swords." He took another step forward, close enough that the heat from the fire bathed them both in its golden glow. "Let them whisper," he said. "Their words can wound, but they cannot dictate the truths we choose to see for ourselves." A silence fell, thick and charged. Evelyn's gaze flicked to the window, where the storm's fury painted the glass with streaks of rain, distorting the world beyond. For years she had built walls around herself, walls of dignity, of solitude, of cautious independence. And now, in the presence of a man who had already dared to disarm her before, she felt them quiver. The room seemed to contract, the flickering firelight illuminating every subtle expression, every unspoken thought. She realized, with a sudden, almost terrifying clarity, that she was no longer merely defending her estate or her reputation. She was guarding the fragile, uncharted territory of her heart. He stepped closer still, and for a moment, the room existed only for the two of them, the storm outside a distant echo, the world beyond the manor irrelevant. His hand hovered near hers as though to offer support, or perhaps to claim it, yet neither moved. The tension was a delicate thread, stretched taut between restraint and desire. "Tell me," he murmured, his voice low and deliberate, "do you fear the truth of what we might feel, or merely the judgment of those who cannot understand?" She inhaled sharply, aware of how near he had come, how commanding his presence had become. "I fear both," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, the admission heavier than any declaration of love could ever be. He reached out, gently covering her hand with his, the contact sending a pulse of heat up her arm. "Then let us choose carefully," he said, "what truths we share and with whom." The intimacy of the gesture, though simple, shattered the careful composure she had maintained for months. She withdrew only slightly, not out of fear but out of habit, the instinct to protect herself stronger than the desire to surrender. Yet even in retreat, her eyes lingered on his, searching for the words she could not speak aloud. The fire crackled, casting shadows across their faces, and in those shadows lay unspoken confessions, tentative and dangerous. Evelyn felt the weight of all that had been denied to her, the laughter she had withheld, the longing she had buried, the moments of vulnerability she had deemed too costly. And here he was, a man who had come not to command, not to judge, but to see her fully without pretense. She wanted to speak, to articulate the tumult within her, yet words faltered like fragile birds, escaping only in murmurs. A sudden knock at the door startled them both. A servant entered, bowing. "Pardon your grace, my lady. Guests have arrived unexpectedly, Mrs. Whitmore and her daughter." Evelyn's heart tightened at the reminder that propriety would intrude upon this delicate moment. Alexander stepped back, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Duty calls," he said softly, though his eyes lingered, unwilling to break the connection. She straightened, regaining composure, and allowed a polite, distant smile. "Yes, duty," she echoed, the word tasting bitter yet necessary. As the servant departed, the storm outside began to abate, leaving a fine mist clinging to the windows. Evelyn and the Duke exchanged one last glance, charged with the knowledge that what had passed between them in the private sanctuary of the drawing-room could not remain unacknowledged. It was a truth they both felt but dared not yet name, a fragile confession of hearts on the brink of surrender. She turned, moving toward the hallway to meet her unexpected guests, her steps measured, her mind tumultuous. Alexander watched her leave, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, and whispered to himself, "I would rather face ruin than allow this to remain unspoken." The storm had passed, but the tempest between them had only begun. Outside, the mist clung to the grounds, hinting at a world transformed, not by weather but by the subtle, undeniable shift in two lives destined to collide. In the quiet aftermath, the Duke remained alone, his thoughts tethered to the woman who defied him at every turn and yet had claimed his attention wholly. London, society, duty, they could wait. For the first time in years he was willing to let them wait. The night drew on, the manor settling into silence, and somewhere in the depths of Ashbourne Manor, Evelyn's heart raced with the knowledge that the presence of one man, calm, resolute, and utterly undeterred, had begun to unravel the careful barriers she had spent a lifetime constructing. The chapter of propriety and prudence was ending. A new story, fragile, dangerous, and irresistibly alive, was taking its first tentative steps into existence. Spring had arrived at Ashbourne Estate, though the air was still crisp with the lingering chill of late March. The gardens were alive with blooms, daffodils nodding in the breeze, tulips unfurling like painted silk, and the first roses stretching their velvet petals toward the sun. London society had gathered for a fete held in the sprawling grounds, a celebration of social stature disguised as gentle festivity. Yet among the laughter, the music, and the carefully measured pleasantries, one woman moved with purpose, Lady Evelyn Ashbourne. Her gown was a soft cream, embroidered with delicate gold thread, and the pearls at her throat caught the sunlight like dew on spider silk. Despite her beauty and poise, her mind was elsewhere, troubled by a letter she had received that morning, a summons to settle her affairs in London, a final demand from creditors, and a reminder that she could not remain unclaimed forever. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, arrived just as the festivities began in earnest. The ton turned instinctively toward him, whispers following his every step, the Duke who pursued the widow who defied him. He ignored them, moving with the grace of a man who had spent years mastering command, though his eyes were fixed solely on her. Evelyn was standing near a marble fountain, her expression composed, yet her fingers clutched a folded fan tighter than necessary. The Duke approached her, the sunlight glinting off his dark coat, and spoke with the calm authority that had both intimidated and intrigued her since their first encounter. "Lady Ashbourne," he said, his voice low, yet clear enough to be heard over the murmur of music and conversation, "it seems London insists on its own narrative. Shall we correct it?" She met his gaze, a mixture of pride and hesitation in her eyes. "Correction requires consent," she replied, her tone steady, though her heart betrayed a flutter she could not suppress. "And I am not certain I consent." He smiled faintly, the curve of his lips carrying a promise that unsettled her. "Then allow me to persuade you," he said simply, offering his arm. She hesitated, glancing at the assembled guests who scrutinized the exchange as though awaiting a scandal, then placed her hand lightly upon his arm. The gesture, though small, was revolutionary, a subtle defiance of society's expectations. The crowd parted naturally, sensing the tension between them, the weight of what they represented. Two figures bound by circumstance, desire, and the unspoken truths of the heart. Alexander led her to a quieter part of the garden, where roses climbed trellises and the sound of a fountain created a private rhythm. "Do you know," he began, his voice soft but unwavering, "how many hearts you have unsettled simply by being yourself?" She lifted an eyebrow, a hint of wry amusement in her gaze. "Many hearts, your grace, are easily unsettled. I am told I have talent in that regard." He inclined his head, stepping closer, the scent of the earth and blooms mixing with a faint trace of his cologne. "I do not speak of talent," he said. "I speak of consequence. The consequence of a woman who refuses to bend, who refuses to yield to expectation, who has nonetheless ensnared a duke entirely against reason." Evelyn's breath caught. She had expected his words, feared them even, but the truth of them struck with a force that left her momentarily silent. She met his gaze, seeing in it the wariness, the longing, and the rare vulnerability of a man who had seldom surrendered. A murmur rose from the distance, the whispers of onlookers noticing the proximity between them, yet in that moment, the world seemed to contract until only the two of them remained. "Alexander," she said finally, using his given name with a careful deliberation that carried intimacy without concession, "we are under the scrutiny of London. There is danger in this, scandal, rumor, reproach." He took her hands in his, the contact deliberate and grounding. "I have never been more aware of danger," he admitted, "nor more willing to face it. I care not for scandal. I care only for you." The weight of his confession settled between them, a tangible presence heavier than any ledger, heavier than any expectation of society. Evelyn's pulse raced. She had spent years guarding her heart, maintaining a fortress built of prudence and decorum. Yet here, in the spring sunlight among roses and fountains, that fortress trembled. She searched his eyes, seeing the honesty there, the surrender he offered not to duty or reputation, but to something entirely human and profound. "Do you truly know what you ask of me?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite herself. "To defy all that is expected, to risk the judgment of every acquaintance, to abandon caution entirely?" He drew a slow breath, his gaze never faltering. "I know. And I would rather face the scorn of society than a lifetime without you at my side. You are the one I desire, Lady Ashbourne. The one I have longed to hold, and I shall not be denied." Her chest tightened. The music from the fete wafted across the garden, distant yet insistent, as if the world demanded they perform propriety even as it trembled beneath the weight of their confession. She wanted to retreat, to shield herself from the vulnerability, yet she found her hands entwined with his, the heat of his palms a comfort she could not name. "Then what becomes of us?" she asked, voice soft, almost incredulous. "Shall we surrender entirely to sentiment and be ruined in the eyes of London?" He smiled, a small, tender curve that illuminated the depth of his feeling. "If ruin is the cost of truth, then let us be ruined together. Let them speak, let them judge. I am already condemned in every way that matters, for I am condemned to love you, utterly and without restraint." The simplicity and force of his words left her momentarily speechless, her pride and caution melting into the warmth of certainty that she had long denied herself. A distant bell told the hour, reminding them of the inevitability of return to society, yet for that instant time had folded in upon itself. Evelyn allowed herself the briefest of smiles, the first unguarded expression she had permitted in months. "Then I shall trust you," she said, "and pray that my folly is matched only by your courage." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the delicate skin at her knuckles, a gesture at once intimate and public, daring yet restrained. Whispers rippled through the garden, but neither seemed to notice, absorbed as they were in the certainty of the other's presence. They walked slowly toward the fountain, hands entwined, eyes meeting with the quiet intensity of a shared secret. The onlookers parted instinctively, sensing the declaration without words. Alexander's gaze never left hers, unwavering, resolute. In that moment they were no longer duke and widow, society and subject, rumor and reputation. They were simply two hearts daring to defy the world together. The fete continued around them, music and laughter blending into a distant murmur, yet the garden held a fragile, perfect bubble of intimacy. Evelyn's thoughts wavered between caution and exhilaration, pride and surrender. She had resisted, deflected, and endured, yet she could not deny the pull of what they had begun to acknowledge. Alexander's hand remained firm around hers, anchoring her against every fear and every whisper. As the sun began its slow descent, casting golden light over the estate and turning the roses to fire. Alexander whispered almost to himself, "We shall endure the world if it will permit us. And if not, we shall endure each other." Evelyn allowed herself to rest her head lightly against his shoulder, the first concession of vulnerability since their acquaintance. The world could wait. Judgment could wait. For the first time she felt the extraordinary weightlessness of trust and the promise of something that might at last be called love. The Duke led her back toward the house, their steps measured, their hands intertwined, and the murmurs of society rose around them, impotent against the quiet strength of their mutual choice. London could judge, could whisper, could scandalize, yet in that moment it mattered nothing. Two hearts, resolute, defiant, and unyielding, had found each other. The first chapter of their shared story, fraught with risk and radiant with possibility, was beginning to unfold. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the gardens of Ashbourne Estate, it was clear to both of them that nothing, neither rank nor rumor, nor the weight of expectation, would keep them apart.